One of the most important pieces of data that you're going to be working with in JavaScript is the object. So objects are a really common piece of data inside of JavaScript and code written with JavaScript. So you're going to see them all the time. So what we'll see here is a representation of what an object actually looks like. So here I've got this example pizza, and I'm going to copy this and paste it over here into CodePen. So if you've never seen this before, head over to codepen.io, and this gives you a nice little environment where you can write some code and test things out without having to spin up an entire project on your computer. So here we've got this variable. We're saying const pizza. So that's us creating or declaring a variable, but then we're assigning it a value of an object. So an object is what we see between the curly braces here. So literally the curly braces, and then we've got these things, and then we've got these commas. So this whole thing together is known as an object. So what this is commonly referred to in programming languages, so not just JavaScript, but other programming languages will talk about this sort of data structure with this name. They'll call them a key value pair. And the reason that they're called key value pairs is that objects have keys. So we always know a key in JavaScript where we see a name followed by a colon, and then we have some value. Now, in this example, I've loaded this up with values that are, these three are strings, and then this fourth one is an array. But values can be any of the built-in JavaScript values. So we could change this to just a number. We could change this to something like a Boolean. And as we'll see later, we could even turn it into a nested object. So there's a lot of different values that we can set on these. But here we're going to keep it simple while we're looking at this example. But here we have our key, here we have our value, and together we call this an object. So these are an object with key value pairs on them. So objects in their nature are pretty simple. There's not a lot going on that you have to know about. It's really more so how do you put them to use. So once you've stored your data in this format, understanding why this is useful or what you're going to actually do with it. So the first thing you have to know if you're going to work with objects is how to actually access the values on those objects. And traditionally, there's two ways to do this. So there are other ways, and we're going to look at a more advanced version of this toward the end of this video. But the two primaries are dot notation and bracket notation. So dot notation is very simple. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop open the console here so we can see some messages that they get printed out. So I'm going to say console.log pizza here. And notice that we get our entire object here, but let's say I wanted to access the crust value here. So, or let me make sure I'm using the correct name. So I want to access the crust key to get its value. So what I'm going to do with dot notation is I'm going to say pizza.crust. And like the name implies, we get our value back, but we're using it by referencing this with a dot. So we're saying pizza dot some key, or this is also referred to as a property on objects, and that name is used interchangeably when you're reading tutorials or learning about this stuff. So this key or this property, crust, all we have to do is say, give us pizza.crust, and we can change this, and we can even say, what cheese is on this? We'll say pizza.cheese, and we notice that down here we get the value mozzarella, which is pretty cool. So that's one way of accessing properties on an object, but there's another way, which is known as bracket notation. So in the same way, I can say, okay, we have our pizza, and down here we get our full pizza, but we can also do this. So we can say, give us and you'll notice that what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the brackets on the end of the variable that has my object stored in it. So in this case, pizza has this object stored in it. So I'm going to use the brackets on the end, and then inside of those brackets, I'm going to put single quotes, and you can do double quotes if you want to as well, but I'm going to use single quotes, and I'm going to say, okay, I want to access the sauce key, so I'm going to say sauce like that, and you'll notice I'm getting a bunch of undefines, but as soon as I change it to this, so here's the complete code that we're after, we're going to get back red, which is pretty neat. So you may be wondering, and this is something early on that can be really confusing, but why would I use dot notation versus, and let's put these side by side just so we can see them. So we're going to say pizza sauce and pizza dot sauce. So pizza bracket sauce, pizza dot sauce. So notice we get the same exact response from both of those, but there's some significance to why we would use one over the other. So the first is depending on how you've labeled your keys in your object or your properties in your object, you might actually be forced to use bracket notation. So what I mean by that is, notice if I do this, so I'm going to add another key. I'm going to say is available true. So we're going to set that to a Boolean true. And we may not even actually get an error here. Let's see if we get one in the browser console. There we go. So notice how we get this syntax error, unexpected token. The reason that's happening is because I've added this key here, is dash available. And JavaScript is hitting that dash and it's saying, I don't know what that is. So there's nothing wrong with using a key name with a dash in it, but if we want to do that, what we have to do is we have to wrap it in quotes. And again, here I'm using single quotes. And what we're going to do, just to make sure this is clear, we're going to get rid of this. And we're going to say pizza. And I want to show you why brackets are important. So I'm going to say pizza.is-available. And we're going to notice we get the exact same thing, but we actually get a weirder error. So we get available is not defined. So it's actually seeing this pizza.is as the value that we're after, and then this weird dash. So it's almost like it's subtracting available from pizza.is. So if this was a number, so let's just do this to make this clear. So we'll say is 5, and then outside of here we'll say const available equals 3. So now that I've done that, notice that we get the response back that JavaScript expects. So we're saying 5 minus 3 is 2. So that's why we can't write our code like this. So what we're going to do, let's get rid of that math stuff. And we are talking about pizza after all, so this should be fun. So if we want to access that is available property on our object and get back true, we have to do our bracket notation instead. So we're going to wrap this with the curly braces, or not the curly braces, the square braces, and we're going to pass a single quote string, and we're going to put is-available in that string. And what we'll see is we get our response back, so we get our property. So that's one difference of why you would want to use the bracket notation for accessing your keys or your properties over accessing it with dot notation. So that's one. The other, and this is one of my more favorite features of JavaScript. So what I'm going to do is copy this example over here, and I'm going to paste this in. Let's get rid of that comment. So what I want to show you, let's see if we can get it to do it. Let's clear that console. So I'm going to say, we got rid of our pizza. So let's jump back up here real quick, and I'm going to steal this object. And we're going to paste that up there. Let's see how we do. There we go. So what I just did was I used this built-in JavaScript method. And if you haven't already checked it out, make sure to check out the other video in this Feature Fundamentals series on what are JavaScript functions. We talk about functions and what are methods and all that stuff. So if you haven't already checked that out, click the link up in the top corner and that'll take you over there so you can review that. But what I'm doing here is I'm saying, let me access this object.keys method. So I know it's a method because I see some object name and then I'm saying dot and then some function name. So whenever a function is defined on an object, we call that a method. So here I'm accessing the object.keys method and I'm passing it our object. So what this code is doing, so up until that point, that's giving us back all of the keys or properties on our object in an array. So if I take this and we'll just say console.log object.keys, notice that what we get, and so this is the output for that, is we get an array with all of the key names as strings, which is super convenient. So what this allows us to do is something like what I've got here. So what I'm saying is I want to loop over all of the keys in this pizza object, and for each one, I want to call some function. So some function here is this function we've defined, and what we're saying is for each property or each key on that object, we want that value, whatever it is, passed. So making sure this is clear, each key meaning each one of these. So in this array down here, we're saying this one, and then this one, and then this one, and so on and so forth. So what we're saying here is for each loop, give us that value, whatever it is. So here we've got crust. So that is going to be passed in as a variable called ingredient. And then ingredient is taken in our function, and we can do whatever we want with it. So what you'll notice is that here I'm saying I want to log out the name of that ingredient. And then, so when I say the name of that ingredient, what I'm saying is the name of that key. So like meats would log out here. So we can see right here I've got meats logging out. But then what I'm doing is I'm accessing, using bracket notation, some property on the pizza object. So what's interesting about this is that we don't really know which ingredient is currently being looped over in this for each. And what's cool is we can pass the variable name ingredient from up here into these brackets, so using bracket notation, and whichever item we're currently looping over, we're going to get the value of that key on the pizza object. So here we're saying meats, and notice we get back the value that's assigned to that object. So that's pretty neat. So that's the second reason that you would want to use bracket notation, is because you don't really know what property you're looking for, and so you want to pass in a variable that's going to move between different possible values or possible keys that you want to access on your object. So once we've gotten through that, the other thing that's worth talking about when it comes to dealing with objects in JavaScript and when you're writing your own programs is nested objects. So what I'm going to do is copy this, and what we'll notice is that this looks pretty similar to what we had before with our pizza. So there's nothing really new here except for we've defined an extra key or property on our object pizza, which is a nested object, and in this case this is a price list for our pizza. So we're saying, okay, if you want this specific pizza, here are the prices based on the size of the pizza. So we're saying, okay, we have prices, and then we assign that an object, and we have 3 keys or 3 properties. So we have small, medium, and large. Each one is assigned a price in the form of, this is a float, so this is technically a number type in JavaScript, but this is known as a float because it has a decimal value in here as opposed to an integer, which is just a whole value. So if this was just, let's get rid of this, if this was just 8 by itself, that would be an integer value, but because we've got the decimal, we call that a float value. So we've got all of our prices in here, and in terms of accessing these values, this works in a very similar way to what we saw before. So if we want to get the price of a small version of this pizza or small size of this pizza, what we can do, and let's go ahead and clear out our consoles here. Let's clear that one and bring this down. So what we can do is we can say, well, give us pizza.prices. Now if we do this, predictably we're going to get back the entire prices object, but we can follow these dots as far down as our data will let us go, as far down as it's actually defined. So we're going to say pizza.prices. Let's say medium. So give us the medium price, and we should get $11.99, which we do. So nested objects are really great when you have a ton of data that's related, but you don't want it to be, and this is what we would call top level. So these are top level properties, so all of these are on the same level. So think of this like if you're walking into a building, this is the first floor, and then when we start nesting, this is the next level down. So this is like the second floor, and then we could even nest another. So we'll just say, we'll just call it nester, and then we'll say test 1, 2, 3. Now, this is cool, but there are limitations here. So the limitations are not imposed by JavaScript, but they should be imposed by us, the developers. So the thing to keep in mind is that the more you nest objects into a parent object, the harder and harder it's going to be for you to access the properties of that object. And where this becomes a problem is if you're in a situation where, say the data that goes into your object is variable, meaning you don't know that nester is always going to be a nested object. You don't know that large, medium, and small are always going to be there. You don't know what's always going to be there. And so if you're writing code like this, in this specific example, we know that prices.medium is defined. But if we were in a situation, let's actually do this. So we're going to say get rid of medium. So if we're in a situation where that doesn't exist, notice that we're getting back undefined. And now if we get into a situation where, say, prices is optional, that's not always included on an object, well, if I delete prices from here, now we're going to get an error. So we're going to get, oh, well, I can't read property medium of undefined, so the thing that's undefined in this case is prices. So when it comes to nested objects, you got to be super careful. You don't want to put yourself in a position where you're accessing things that you can't actually access, which is it's kind of problematic. So keep that in mind when you're using nesting, but realize that it is a powerful tool when you're careful with it. So next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about copying objects. So this is another common thing that you're going to do in relation to objects. So we have defining the objects, and we have pulling properties off of those objects with dot notation and bracket notation, but we also may want to create copies of objects. And so one way to do that is using this built-in method object.assign. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this one over here. I'm going to paste that in. So this is just like we saw before, except this time we've got our prices in here, and we've got the full object that we've built up so far in this tutorial. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new pizza. So we'll say, I don't know, this was our most popular pizza, but we've decided we're going to expand and we want to add a new pizza to our menu. So what we're going to do is we're going to use object.assign. Now what this is doing is this is taking in two arguments. So the first argument is referred to as the target. So this is the target object. So in this case, we're going to pass in our pizza. And then we're also going to pass in a source object. So this is essentially the changes that we want to make to this object. So think of this like, okay, a person goes into the cloning machine, and then these are the attributes that we want to change on the person, and then when all is said and done, object.assign is going to return, in this case, not a person, they're going to return a pizza. So we'll get back a new pizza, which should be the combined result of assigning these properties back to our original, our target object, which is pizza in this case. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we're going to change the crust here. So our brand new pizza is exactly the same, except this is a regular crust version of it. So we're going to say crust, and we're going to say, in a quote, we're going to say regular. Now, if we go ahead and log this out, what we're going to see, let's do this like that, is that even though we passed in our original pizza, so when I say our original pizza, I mean this object up here, even though we passed it in with these properties, and pay attention to this crust one. So when we passed it in, crust was thin, but because we're using object.assign, whatever we pass in this second object is technically going to override whatever's in the first or the target object. So the source is always going to override the target. So in this case, I have crust regular being assigned here, and so the new pizza is going to say, oh, well, you know what, I can't have two crusts, so I'm going to override with whatever the new or the latest value is. So I'm going to override it with the regular crust. And so if we look down here, we'll see that when we log it out, we get crust back as regular instead of thin, even though we started with thin, which is pretty neat. So this isn't just limited to changing properties that already exist. You can also use this to add other stuff. So one of the other things that we can do, let's see, why don't we add vegetables to this? So we're going to say, actually, we're not going to add it there. We're going to add it right here. So we're going to dynamically add this. We're going to say vegetables, and we'll say, I don't know, I like mushrooms on my pizza. So we're going to say mushrooms like that. And we'll notice that when this logs out now, our crust has been changed to regular, and we've gained a vegetables array. So up here, notice our source, or our target object doesn't have a vegetables array defined on it. That's brand new. But using object.assign, we end up changing the crust, but we also get a new vegetables array, which is pretty neat. So that's one way to do this. Another one, and this is my personal favorite, and as you get more experience, you're going to see more and more of this, which is to use the what's known as the spread operator. So here we've gone back to our original pizza, but now we're going to create our new pizza using the spread operator. So we're going to say const new pizza. And the way that we do this is a little bit different. So instead of using a function like object.assign or a method like object.assign, what we can do is just create our object, our new object that we're trying to create, and then we can use ... and then we'll say pizza. And what I'm going to do to make sure we can see this, I'm going to say console.log new pizza. Let's go ahead and clear this out. So what we'll notice is that I get back my exact pizza from before. So even though I'm logging new pizza, this object has essentially turned into this object up here, this pizza up here. So what's neat about this is when we do this, what we're essentially saying is, and the example that I like to use with folks that I'm teaching is, well, say you go to a hotel, and in that hotel there is a dresser drawer. And when you travel, technically you have luggage with you and you have some clothes, and maybe if you're going to stay for a while, you'll unpack your luggage into the dresser drawers in the hotel room. And that's essentially what this is doing with our data. So what we can see is that we have our new object, and we're saying on that new object, or the dresser drawers in the hotel, we want to take our suitcase, pizza, and we want to unpack its contents into those dresser drawers. So here we have, kind of extension of disbelief for a second. We have our crust t-shirt, we have our cheese jeans, we have our sauce sweater. This is actually working out pretty well. I'm pretty proud of this one. So we have all of these things, and what we're going to do with the ... is we're going to spread them out, or we're going to unpack them onto this new object. So that's neat, but where this gets really interesting is with examples like what we saw before. So we already know that we have crust, and we can see down here that we're getting back. That's interesting that CodePen's ignoring it in that console, but we are seeing it here. Actually, I think I can explain that. So the thing with the ... syntax is that may not be supported everywhere that you're writing JavaScript. That's a modern syntax, and that was introduced in the 9th version of JavaScript, or ECMAScript, or the 2018 version. So you'll hear those names used interchangeably. It's ES9 or ES 2018, but that's a fairly new thing. And so while you can write code like this using something called a transpiler, and certain modern browsers also support it, you can't guarantee that it's always going to be available. So if you write this in a code and say maybe you need to support an older browser like Internet Explorer, we'll say, I'm guessing like 8 or 9, that syntax isn't going to be recognized, and so your code isn't going to work. And so you're going to need to use a secondary tool known as a compiler or transpiler to convert your code from this into something that those older browsers will recognize. So what that means is you can write your code like this, but you'll pass that code through a transpiler before you actually get your end resulting file that you would load up in a browser. So that way it's supported by everybody. But in this case, we know that Google Chrome is pretty up to date. They've implemented this feature already, so let's go ahead and space this out and see if we can get it to do it. There it goes. And it looks like this time it did. So that must have been me. I must have pushed the clear button or something. So we are getting our object back, and we can see that our new pizza, oh, it's fighting me for some reason. It does not want to, yeah, it's refusing to expand itself. Let's see if we can do that. There we go. That's a little better. So we're getting our new object, or our new pizza in this case, with all the properties of the original pizza. So you might imagine that, okay, one of the things that we can do is, well, we can override things, or we can add additional things. So the reason I like the syntax is it's a little clearer in that process. So instead of all the object.assign stuff, what we can do is we can just add the properties. So in this case, well, I want to copy the original pizza, but this time I want to change the crust, and this one we'll just say thick crust. And so notice that this time, when this logs out, now the crust is thick as opposed to thin, which is pretty cool. So first what we're doing is we're saying, okay, copy the contents of this pizza object up here to this new object, but then we're going to set crust again. And again, JavaScript is going to see in this instance 2 keys with the same exact name. So 2 keys called crust, and it's going to say, I can't do that. So let me take the last one in, and that's going to be on this new pizza object, the value for crust. So in this case, thick, because we put that last. And in the same exact way where we saw with vegetables, notice up here we don't have vegetables on our original pizza, but we can come down here and we can say vegetables, and we'll do the mushrooms again. So we'll say mushrooms. And we'll notice now, just like we'd expect, we get back our new object. Man, this thing's really fighting me. Let's pull that up. There we go. So we get our new object with our vegetables on there. So that's pretty neat. So that's the basics of copying objects and all that stuff. And to wrap up, what I want to do is I want to show you one more version of accessing the properties on an object. And I saved this for last because this is pretty advanced, and it's not something that you have to do, but it is helpful in terms of writing cleaner code, or code that's a little easier to understand as you get more advanced. So what we're going to do is we're going to back up to our original object here, and we're going to learn something called destructuring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add some properties here. So we got meats, and then we're going to set this equal to pizza. So this is pretty interesting syntax here. So let's clear that out. and clear that out. And then we're going to say console.log. Let's do crust. So we're going to say console.log crust. Let's see. There it goes. So now notice that we're getting thin. And you may be wondering, well, wait a minute, how did that work? Because if I do this another way, what we learned before is I'd have to do something like pizza.crust, or I'd have to say pizza crust. So what's going on here? This is known as destructuring. So if you think about it in more simple terms, this is us plucking things off of some objects. When we're saying destructuring, like imagine us tearing down a building, we're going to pull it down in parts. We're not just going to pull it down all at once. So in this case, we're destructuring whatever object we put here. So the syntax is a little weird. So what we do is we start with our variable declaration. So here we're saying const, and then we use this bracket syntax. And what we do inside of those brackets is we specify the names of properties that we want to pick off of whatever object we put over here on the right. So in this case, I'm saying pizza is the object that I want to destructure, and I want to pick off crust, cheese, sauce, and meats. So let's go ahead and log those all out. So we're going to say we've got crust, cheese, sauce, and meats. So if we log those out, there we go. So we get our thin crust, our mozzarella cheese, our red sauce, and we get our sausage and pepperoni meats. So we get those, and that's really cool because what's happening automatically without us really doing anything is JavaScript is saying, okay, when you use this syntax, what you're doing is you're telling me in memory. So when we say in memory, we mean as JavaScript is evaluating this code. What JavaScript is doing is it's saying, okay, if there's a property called crust on the pizza, go ahead and create a brand new variable called crust with whatever that value is. So in this case, thin, if we look down here where we logged it out, we log out crust first, we get back thin. So this is really cool. We're literally in real time transforming the property names into variables of the same name in the scope of wherever this destructuring code is written. So we're literally just saying from pizza, pick off these 4 things, which is super neat. So that's one part of this, but you're also probably looking at this like, well, wait a minute, what's this ... rest thing with the whole spread operator business? So one of the alternative names for this syntax, so you'll often hear it referred to as rest spread syntax. So the spread syntax is the dots, but the rest is coming in right here. And what this is doing, so notice that we have this big object. We've got a bunch of different stuff on here. So right now we're plucking off these 4 properties, but we're leaving is available and prices alone. We haven't really done anything with those. So what rest is allowing us to do is say, well, give me these specifically, but then collector, I think of it like a vacuum cleaner sucking everything else up. So we've picked these up by hand, but we want to suck up with a vacuum is available and prices. And what's happening is those are being stored in this value rest. Now, we can't call this whatever we want, so we have to use the word rest, but this is like saying, and here's the rest of the object. So what we can do, we can come down here, we can log rest, and what we'll notice is we get back an object, because that's the rest of the object, so everything without these 4 properties, and we get is available and prices by themselves, which is pretty cool. We could even see it down here in the console, so we get is available and prices as well. So what that's allowing us to do is to suck up everything else that we didn't destructure on the object into a nice little variable so we can reference it. So that way, if typically you'll use this if maybe you need to reference these and then you're going to copy these over to another object or use them somewhere else. Or sometimes you just want to avoid copying anything else from an object except these 4 things. So you'll kind of put everything else off to the side. And you don't have to do that. So if you just want to ignore properties altogether, you don't care about them, you can just pluck off the ones that you want and the other ones will be ignored. You don't have to worry about that, which is pretty cool. And keep in mind, this isn't modifying the pizza object in any way. We're just referencing these properties on the pizza object. So there's no real change being made, which is pretty cool. So that's it. That is a basic introduction to objects in JavaScript. And again, these things are super powerful and they're super helpful when you're building your application because they make it so easy to collect together all these different chunks of data and give them names that are really descriptive. So like in this case, this makes a ton of sense. We have an object referenced as a pizza, and we can see all of these things that contextually make sense. We have all these toppings and ingredients, and then we know the prices of it. And it makes it really nice to create these super tight data structures that make it easy to read through our code and reason through our code, as well as once we move this data into a database to reason about how our data is stored in our database. So I think that's going to do it for this episode of Feature Fundamentals. If you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below and hit the bell right next to it, because it's really helpful when you guys subscribe. It lets me know that you're into these things and you want to see more of them. And also, give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, because it's helpful to know which content is working and which stuff is not terribly helpful, because I don't want to waste your time and I don't want to waste my time. So definitely give this a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. So I think we're going to wrap up here, folks. So thanks for watching, and we will see you for the next Feature Fundamentals.